Oui, je l'ai vu. Oui, lui aussi, de mettre la caméra. Moi, je sais pas quoi il ressemble, je pourrais pas reconnaître.
Hi, you're Todd. Nice to meet you. And thanks for joining us.
Hi, Anjli, nice to meet you.
Feel free to put your coat on either reserved seats aisle or with Miriam. I'm just going to take your title down.
Director for University of Chicago and also Global Human Rights Conference.
Well, seeing something up there, so.
Human Rights Conference.
Hello, Tyron. Can you hear me?
Hi. Good morning.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Do you mind if we take a quick, just candid picture right now?
Sure. I mean,
And before you guys start,
we'll start in 3 minutes or so.
when you start, it'd be good to just have a pause to have everyone
Okay.
for a nice
With the two
center.
speakers as
That
well.
would be nice. This is Sarah.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. I'm going to take a picture.
Yeah,
It's going to
sure.
be really quick. So just please look at me. Smile. Perfect. One more. That's one. Thank you very much. And welcome back. We have one more missing, right? Or is it online?
There are 2 online.
2 online.
So there should be Brian and there should be
So
Anastasia.
the stage is fine right now, right? We have everyone on the stage.
Yeah, on the stages.
Perfect.
So they're both there. Fine. Got a slight problem with our colleague Brian who couldn't log on. He's there. Looks like he's there.
Been doing okay. I'm kind of running from one thing to another, but I'm happy to be here. I just have to center that I'm here.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I've left something else.
Fair enough. Feel free to have a bit of a few seconds of quiet then to be able to.
Oh no.
Should be an
So
interesting.
how are you moderating this?
So
Because you're dominating the discourse, you wanted to make sure you got. I'm sorry.
no, you can. Well, so it was a mixture of. So I spoke to all of the panelists or people supporting the different panelists in creating a conversation.
Right.
To both make sure that there's a sense of conversation, but also that we're saying things that each of the panelists would like to share. And so that's why we are sort of going into your previous experience in Colombia and then your current experience here. But indeed, the idea was to try and craft a conversation about making the case for human rights in peace building. And then the nexus with the development bit was important also to make sure that we're sort of squaring that triangle, I guess. So yeah, so it is also meant to be sort of a conversation, which is why it is quite pointed rather than statement.
Right.
So it's sort of
Well, which is better. But the problem is the first question I could have written 2 volumes about.
I know, it's a PhD.
So it's a little bit, so I've tried to I even was like saying I have to narrow my thoughts, on this. And I still end up like with a page and a half of saying like,
It's a fascinating topic.
Oh, it is.
Been a
It's
human rights entity in a mediation process.
No, and we actually had a huge impact.
That's what we want to hear.
Yeah, but
I know 5 minutes is cheating your experience, but
so I'll try to be.
But there is hopefully going to be some questions, and if there aren't, then we will be coming back also both in the Q&A to the speakers and also in terms of the closing. And that's why for the closing I really emphasize if there are things that you haven't been able to say, use the closing to say it. It's not, you don't have to have a grand conclusion.
And how much are people looking forward that we throw some bombs into the industry or?
Do.
I think so.
I think challenge.
Interesting.
Challenge, make it interesting. I have no, it doesn't have to be, people, if people remember this panel, that's what I want them to remember. Like, I want to remember, like, key message. I want people here to say, that panel on Thursday was great. Controversially great.
So, but you must be used to being at the University of Chicago, the home of
Sort of
neoliberalism.
Yeah,
I mean,
I just
seeing
got
the
there, so I've been there
inequalities.
about 6 weeks, and so I was at Columbia until 6 weeks ago, and so yeah, I'm very new to perpetuating inequality, or yeah, very used to that debate.
So I guess we are 3 minutes after the time. But the fact nobody likes
And
the
Brian is on.
Brian is on, so is
Brian.
Anastasia. I don't know I don't think they'll be able to hear you if you don't use the mic. That's the only thing.
Who's the third?
So it's 4. So it's Anastasia, Brian,
But there's,
yourself.
I can see 3 down there. That's why I was
Right,
looking up
it's
going,
it's
did
the tech.
I miss something?
No, it's the tech. There's like quite a big tech sort of support unit to be able to make sure that everything runs smoothly. So I don't think there's an action call, so I might call it. Good afternoon, everyone. Seeing as it's a few minutes after 1:30, we'll start our conversation. So thank you for spending part of your lunchtime break with us today. We'll be talking about human rights, inequalities and peace, navigating tensions and finding opportunities. I'll repeat the blurb of the track today because you'll have seen events this morning, participated in them, and there are more events this afternoon on this track. So please go and have a look at them if you have time and any interest in doing so. There's also more tomorrow. So perhaps just to set the scene a little bit, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development explicitly combines the promotion of peaceful, just and inclusive society in its Goal 16, which seeks to promote peaceful and inclusive society for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. In that same vein, the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly acknowledged for the first time in 2016 the crucial relationship between human rights, development, and peace through the twin resolutions on sustaining peace. The work of peace builders, development, and human rights actors on the ground often touches on one another and produces ad hoc, innovative collaborations. Yet, if people working on devising solutions to problems operate in specific analytical frameworks, and only use approaches they are familiar with, operational collaboration, finance, and reciprocal learning across these fields is likely to sustain siloed practice and prevent opportunities for collaborative approaches to emerge. You may have been part of discussions this morning that in their own way contribute to answering the following questions. How do current peacebuilding practice integrate human rights analysis and approaches? How is this reflected in multilateral diplomacy and at the policy level? What innovative practice, experiences, and stories from country-specific contexts are there of how confronting human rights violations, injustice, and exclusion has contributed to sustaining peace, and what lessons can we learn from those? We have here 4 speakers who are going to attempt in their own way in answering some of these questions from their own experience professionally, but also in their current roles that you can see up at the top. So online, we have Brian Williams, Chief Financing for Peacebuilding from the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. We have Dr. Anastasia Shesterinina, who's there as well, currently located in Colombia, director of the Center for Comparative Study of Civil War, senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield. And here in the room, we have Anjli Parrin, who is newly director of the University of Chicago's Law School Global Human Rights Clinic. And last but not least, Todd, Howland, Chief of Development and Economic and Social Issues Branch of the High Commissioner for Human Rights here in Geneva. We'll have a couple of rounds of questions, and so I've selected a few questions to ask each of our panelists in view of sort of creating a dynamic exchange between us here on the stage, and we'll come to you for a Q&A session before rounding up with a round of final reflections from our panelists. So, to set the scene, we'll start with the screen in the name of inclusion. So we bring in the screen straight away. Anastasia, help us set the scene here. How do you understand the relationship between human rights and peace? And how should we understand the notion of human rights violations that happen to individuals or groups in relation to a country's own peace or conflict trajectory? Anastasia, over to you.
First in Georgia and now in Colombia. And I'd like to start by sharing one life history with you that takes us back to August 14th, 1992, when Georgian forces entered Abkhazia and encircled this territory in the span of a day. For Marina, an Abkhaz woman, it was a regular day. She was making jam in her garden before she heard the news of Georgian tanks, which shook her profoundly. Like her fellow Abkhaz, after the incorporation of Abkhazia into the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic in the 1930s, Marina's parents and grandparents experienced firsthand the closure of Abkhaz schools, prohibition of the Abkhazian language and cultural institutions, rejection of the Abkhaz part in the history of Abkhazia, and inability to secure jobs. Marina also experienced decades of mobilization, from everyday confrontation with local Georgians to protests and violent clashes. So while the events of 1992 came as a shock, these memories meant to Marina that Georgia's goal was to eradicate the Abkhaz group and Abkhazia as a unit separate from Georgia, one with an independent cultural history. In other words, it posed an existential threat to her people, her family, and her own safety. And so Marina, with her daughter, went to the military headquarters to enlist into the Abkhaz force as a nurse. She performed these and combat duties and turned into a social leader after the war, as gender roles transformed in Abkhazia due to the wartime loss of men and post-war restrictions on their movement. And today, Marina speaks of the many traumas of that war, but she defends ongoing displacement of most of the pre-war Georgian population from Abkhazia, as she doesn't see any other way for Abkhazia to maintain its de facto state status, even if this is unjust. Marina's trajectory is far from unique and reflects hundreds of life histories that my research team has collected in Colombia, Nepal, Lebanon, South Sudan, and other contexts. The lessons that we learn from these very participants in the armed conflicts are manifold, but I'd like to highlight one. We need to broaden our understanding of why conflicts take place and move beyond a focus on human rights violations during armed conflict as a moment to long-term histories of the suppression of rights and inequalities that entrench political, social, economic practices undermining certain groups' capacity to realize their life projects, like in the case of Abkhazia, or at a minimum to satisfy their basic needs. And these histories are not just context. They define people's lived experiences and matter for the choices people make when faced with unthinkable dilemmas that armed conflicts present. How ordinary people understand their roles in these conflicts cannot be detached from these experiences, and their collective actions in turn shape broader trajectories of conflict and peace. We see this prominently in the case of Ukraine today, where mobilization of ordinary people has been the bedrock of Ukrainian anti-Russia resistance. And these histories are also essential for identifying pockets of prevention. the Georgian Abkhaz family and friendship ties, and the federal solution proposed before the war in Abkhazia could have helped prevent this war. And so could inclusion of the Abkhaz as a party at the negotiations table after the war prevent protracted post-war violence. But these histories were not taken into account. And so the result has been the deepening of conflict over time rather than finding opportunities for peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. And now into the room, Anjli. Anastasia just spoke about the trajectories of grievances and honing in on, rather than honing in on a particular right or a particular violation, but rather looking at it long term. What are the other areas or themes where you see this particular dynamic playing out? And I'm being a bit cheeky here because I know that you have a long list of different themes that you've been addressing over your career, but I think a couple might be worth mentioning here. So over to you.
Thanks, Flo, and thanks, QUNO, for having me. It's a great question. I think just about any complex issue is both simultaneously a human rights issue and a peace-building issue. Because to the extent to which it contributes to exclusion, or to the extent to which you see challenges with justice, these are going to pertain to both. So there is a huge need to deal with questions of climate change as it applies to both peace-building and human rights. Migration is another big issue. There's been a lot of work over the last decade or so looking at youth peace and security and the nexus to think about the ways in which young people contribute both positively and as instigators of conflict. Same thing with taking a gender lens. But two that I'd like to touch on mostly today is thinking about the ways in which a human rights and peace-building approach can think about socioeconomic rights, and the ways in which it can think about identity-based justice, specifically racial justice and other forms of exclusion. Firstly, to move beyond kind of civil and political rights, I think there's a well-established discourse, and a lot of my own work focuses on the ways in which people whose violation, right to life is taken during conflict deserve justice. People who have been physically attacked, who've been tortured during conflict deserve justice. And there's been a lot of rhetoric, but maybe less practice, that looks at how do we think about socioeconomic rights from a peace-building perspective and from a human rights and justice perspective. I was talking with a young Yemeni youth activist, and both sort of peace builder and human rights activist doesn't seem to identify as either. And he was telling me, I was asking him about the importance of human rights, and he was saying, there's no point asking me to reconcile with my neighbor or to engage in peace building with my neighbor if I don't yet have a house. And I think for me that ultimately summarizes a lot of the grievances that people feel with respect to conflict, is that if you haven't addressed the underlying socioeconomic exclusion and inequality that exists within society, you're probably going to continue to maintain those causes for grievances and unrest going forward. And I think the last 3 years has taught us this. There was very little attention prior to the pandemic about the importance of a health-centered approach to either human rights or peace building or inequality. It just was not seen as a core issue. And I think the pandemic has laid bare the different types of exclusion and inequalities that we see around the world and the ways in which this can contribute to violence and conflict. It's brought together questions of who has access to what healthcare, who deserves what access to healthcare, who has vaccine access, and where are clinical trials happening, and where are people actually getting access to the medication. And it's something that we need to think about much more seriously from a peace building perspective. Because once you start to get to those root causes of why violence happens, I think you can start to frame more sustainable responses. And related to that is a focus on identity and racial justice and generally the ways in which specific groups feel excluded in spaces. A lot of the field of transitional justice looks at a concept of civic trust. How do people trust
each other and start to rebuild bonds where they can have conversations between Abkhaz and Georgian, for example? And also, do people trust their governments? What's that aspect of vertical trust? And I think looking at racial justice allows us a unique opportunity to start to think about deeper fractures that go beyond a traditional theater of warfare, to thinking about how do we address legacies of long-term harm and violence and exclusion. For example, slavery in the US and sort of continuing legacies of police brutality, or the impact of colonialism. It allows us to start to think about, why do we have the borders that we have? Why do we have, why are we sitting in Geneva having Peace Week? Why are we actually discussing some of these questions from specific sites of power rather than others? And it allows us to take a much more long-term view towards peace building. So it's not about that immediate post-conflict moment, but it's about thinking about the decades and centuries afterwards, and the ways in which society continues to be fractured, and the ways in which ultimately inequality exists for specific groups around the world.
Thank you very much. And so looking at these two sort of complementary looks at sort of human rights in a historical perspective and how it intersects with social cohesion, injustice, and peace. Over back to the screen, and Brian, looking at more sort of the institutional level, seeing as you're sort of within the Peacebuilding Support Office, and there was a recent thematic review taking place on local peacebuilding, for instance, and perhaps there are some lessons there that the Peacebuilding Support Office and the Peacebuilding Fund have been doing. But beyond that, it would be really interesting to hear from you how you see within your work peace and human rights playing out from the New York perspective. So over to you on screen, Brian.
Thanks very much. I hope everybody can hear me. One of the tragedies about doing this remotely online is you can't see the room. So I hope the room is full, and I hope the room is full of folks that know what the Peacebuilding Fund is and the Peacebuilding Support Office. We are, of course, sitting in New York in the UN headquarters, and we finance largely UN programs focused on peacebuilding around the world. So you're right, we did do recently a review, a thematic review. So that's where we look at all of our portfolio across all the countries and pick on one particular theme. And this theme recently was local peace building. So I think, like many other organizations, we're scratching our heads and trying to figure out how to support communities better than we have in the past. Our local, the review, unsurprisingly, came up with a lot of the same recommendations to us as a UN fund as other organizations are struggling with. So firstly, we want to think about local as not just national, right? So a big NGOs that are in the capital city, and maybe they're not based in London, maybe they're based in whatever country we're working in, but still a capital city NGO is not the same as a truly local organization. Some of the stories we've already heard this morning. So how to figure out how to go really local is a key issue. Secondly, and I started my career off working with NGOs, and I feel the same way. Organizations learn by doing, and so when so much of the typical approach, and I don't mean it badly, but just it's the way the development business is rolled out over the decades. So much of it is about capacity building of somebody else. You do the training for somebody else instead of letting them have a chance to run things themselves. So we're really trying hard to actually provide money. So when we're giving grants, to have them sub-granted on to the local organizations so that they can not only, do the substance and advocacy or community work that they're trying to do, but they can also learn how to be an organization. They can learn how to hire staff. They can learn how to do procurement. They can learn how to be accountable for resources to whoever their funders are. Because what we're trying to do is to build movements here, movements that can participate in democratic spaces, and they need to learn how to be organizations just like the civil society movements in countries all over the world. So it's about institution building as much as it is about supporting, a particular advocacy or new law or set of activities that's going to take place over 18 months. It's about supporting the actual institutions. We try and do this in particular with our women's organization. So we have a gender equality and women's empowerment and peace building, a gender promotion initiative, we call it. We're trying hard specifically with that and with youth. We have some criteria for those global promotion initiatives that require a certain percentage, 40%, to go in cash transfers to local organizations. So we're trying really hard to work on that. Just to echo, I think what preceding speaker was just talking about having, activities that are about horizontal social cohesion, as well as vertical. I don't really like that phrase, vertical, but state-society relations. So you're trying to work at trusting government, trust in the authorities, and that requires, not someone just becoming trusting. It requires changed behavior on the part of the authorities. And I think one of the things that we can all do better is we can learn from some of the behavior change movements over recent years in a variety of different development themes, and apply it actually to local authorities and to governments, so that we start having discussions with those authorities about what's the changed behavior we're looking to see on their side, and then let's see how that's reflected in people's trust in government on the other side. But trust doesn't happen because you tell somebody to trust them. Trust happens because that trust gets earned. Another thing we can do better, I think, is to work with authorities to better track the kinds of things that we as peace builders are always wanting to track. So we find ourselves, for example, in the fund, when we're looking at projects and we're trying to get at what's the peace building result in this project, we're often finding ourselves talking about perception surveys, attitude surveys, polling. This isn't surprising, right? I mean, look in our own countries, politics works around polling. And of course, peace building is, primacy of politics is something that came out of those twin resolutions that you were talking about earlier at the opening. And so helping governments to say, look, if you're committed to peace building, if you're interested in these issues and you've signed up for SDG 16, there's a lot of interesting indicators in there. It shouldn't necessarily be the UN or, an international NGO that is measuring people's attitudes. It should also be governments, because if they care about peace building, then they should be caring about what those indicators are. And that provides in and of itself another basis for discussion and advocacy, whether that advocacy is done by the United Nations, whether that advocacy is done by local organizations. And we need to build local organizations' capacity to work on data as well, because part of the role of civil society is to be playing this, often it's called the watchdog function. I don't think it's always necessarily a watchdog function, but they also should be doing the research, generating the data, reflecting on what that means, and putting ideas into the public policy debate space. And that means they need the capacities to be able to do data collection and think about that as well. So we shouldn't just be doing the, supporting institutions to grow to do community work, but also to think about how they can enter into some of the policy arguments. Ultimately, these are difficult decisions in all our societies about how you manage competing perspectives about what countries should do and what kinds of compromises are made. I don't know if I've used up my 5 minutes. I was going to give one more example, but I can save it for later if you'd prefer. I've lost track of time.
Go ahead, and then we can move on to Todd in just a minute. Go ahead, Brian.
Thanks. So one of the examples I was going to talk about are hate speech programs. So we find ourselves doing more and more hate speech programming, and working with social media. I think we find in many countries places where governments were forward-leaning on peace building maybe have withdrawn a little bit, and we find civic space sometimes shrinking. And hate speech is an area where I think there's a bit more common ground about being able to work. So we find ourselves doing a lot of really local level community organization work on hate speech. And what does that mean? It means helping youth organizations and bloggers that are in informal networks learn how to use information tools to track hate speech so that they can track what's happening in some of those discussion spaces, helping to connect them to some of the really big social media platforms. I mean, the companies, Meta and Facebook and Instagram and so on, and helping them learn what are the entry points in those big companies that are supposed to be doing the moderation or are doing the moderation and are cracking down, so that local organizations can have influence on how those big companies react, which as you all know, has a tremendous impact on what happens in those spaces. We do this in a lot of different countries. To give one example, we did a project over the course of the last year in Kenya, where we were supporting the resident coordinator's office, working with civil society organizations, and I think it was the social cohesion office or something like that in the Kenyan government, to be watching really carefully during the election period as to what is happening in the social media space. And I mean, maybe just to conclude, interestingly, we find ourselves as the Peacebuilding Fund doing more programs. I call them peaceful elections programs. So, of course, there's another whole bit of the United Nations in response to a formal government request to support the administration of elections. We don't do any of that, but we find ourselves working in the space around elections a little bit. So working with women's organizations to increase women's participation in elections, or working with women's organizations to advocate for women's related issues in an electoral period, working with youth wings of political parties about, how do you compete in what is fundamentally a conflictual space, right? You're competing for votes. That's how democracy is set up. How do you compete in that way, in a way that is respectful and nonviolent and peaceful? It's not always an obvious answer in many of our countries about how you manage that competition, but do that in a way that is respectful and peaceful. So interesting space that I think peace builders in general can be looking at a little bit more is, how do you engage in that electoral space, not around the administration of the election, that's important, but in the space around. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Brian. And I think all the examples that you've sort of shown, I mean, from somebody who sort of tries to translate peace-building narratives into human rights boxes, I think, some of the procedural rights that you actually mentioned, the right to participate in decision-making processes, that really speaks to, not just the delegation act that often happens when we try and fund programs in different countries, but really empowering people to be able to make those decisions themselves, both in terms of the crafting of their programming and the enacting of them. And then when you talk about hate speech, freedom of speech is something that we throw around a lot, but depending on how it's used and how it's managed, it is a divisive tool too. So I think it's really interesting how you put that really in terms of peace building terms and what the fund is trying to do with it. But moving on to Todd, who's been patiently waiting. Thank you. You have had, I read your bio, which goes to several country-specific experiences, but one that really struck me was the fact that you were in Colombia when the peace process was ongoing, and you were there as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which triggered my interest even more. So tell us about your experience there, and how was it to be part of this process as a human rights stakeholder in that space that was intrinsically a peace-building space?
Thanks, Florence, for the invitation and introduction. I'll divide the presentation of our experience in Colombia into about 5 main points. First is the pre-peace process, which you could say actually lasted for a couple of decades. But that when I became representative of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Colombia, we began to articulate a concept that you rarely hear, which was that with the armed conflict continuing, it was impossible for Colombia to meet its human rights obligations, because under economic, social, and cultural rights, the state has to maximize its available resources to invest in education, health, social protection. And we took this position because we thought it was extremely important, because conflict had become normal. It had just gone on for decades. It had become something that most Colombians, in terms of population, weren't affected by anymore. So we wanted to put it back into the public discourse. Second, there was a really interesting initiative, which was also, let's say, preparation for the peace process done by the government. They created what they called a victims law and a land restitution law. Both of these also had to do with economic rights. They had to do with the fact that most victims of the conflict were in rural areas, and most victims had been extremely excluded from the benefits of development in Colombia. Many of them had suffered land grabbing or worse. And so the idea of these programs was to actually begin to create trust with the people that were most affected by the conflict. And our office was very active in supporting both the implementation of the victims law and the land restitution law. Second is the specific preparation for peace. When we began speaking to the government that, yes, they were going to try another peace process with the FARC, we picked up our work related to marginalized communities. There's 3 specific marginalized communities: Afro-Colombian, Indigenous, and Campesino in Colombia. And that all of these had limited trust, limited engagement with the government, whether at the local level, departmental level, or national level. And we began to actually spend much more time with social movements in these 3 communities to understand what their concerns were and to legitimize their demands for change. Their marginalization was both ethnic and economical. We started to advocate of the need for inclusion of these communities in what we call modern Colombia. We began to write about a discourse of 2 Colombias, one that had benefited from the development process and another that had been excluded. We also began to intervene more actively with the FARC in terms of speaking to them and saying when they were violating rights and when they weren't respecting ethnic rights, in order to say, like, are you really prepared to respect human rights and enter into a rule of law engagement. Also, what was interesting is the social movements picked up protest. They occupied the Ministry of Interior. They occupied the Ministry of Agriculture. They occupied the airport in Quibdó in Chocó. They occupied the largest port. And we engaged in all of these to push a human rights framework as the means to resolve these social protests. And what do we mean? Is that the demands were often related to a lack of investment in terms of health, education, a lack of action by the government relative to illegal gold mining. And so there was a need to have a resolution, and that resolution we came with, you already have government, you already had pre-existing legal obligations that you weren't meeting to these communities. And so it's actually not something they're forcing you into doing. They're reminding you of the importance of doing this. And you, relative to those that say these people should be kicked out of these places by force, and oftentimes there was a use of force, it reminded the government that they have an argument that, there is part of this that's legitimate. We want you to move out of the occupation, but yes, we should talk to you about the economic, social, and cultural rights violations and political civil rights violations that you're feeling in order to resolve them. We also noticed what happened was those people that were engaged in those negotiations became those that were the first to be invited to Havana. And so our office, the Catholic Church, were some of the first to be invited to Havana to speak to the FARC and to the government about the peace process. There was no peace mission of the UN at that time. It predated that. The third is now during the formal process. Our office pushed and pushed for the inclusion of marginalized communities formally in the process and to create a chapter within the peace process of how to create inclusion of those communities. We also created what we call prioritized communities. We picked 70 communities, and I could spend an hour speaking about each one of these. 70 communities that were affected by the conflict. And in those communities, we worked with them to say, what is your priority, in terms of change? And a lot of times it had to do with access to water, access to health, an intervention relative to contamination, and that this was really about trust that Brian mentioned. It was about facilitating, accompanying the leaders of those communities in their discussions with authorities at 3 levels and saying they have a legitimate demand and facilitating that the government actually respond to those demands. And it was super important to create a different ambiance for the peace process. Another particular effort that we made is that in transitional justice, which usually focuses only on civil and political rights, that transitional justice would also look at the traditional exclusions and push for recommendations relative to economic inclusion. I think one of the other areas that we did within transitional justice is that we facilitated the acts of recognition by the FARC and government. And oftentimes that accompanied a discussion of economic inclusion, even though there was a specific massacre in that space, without thinking further than the recognition of that wrongdoing. To deal with the structural issues that were affecting the community, it would be inadequate. The fourth is the tensions. I would say that the government and the FARC were way more advanced than the UN and the peace and development organizations. Why do I say that? Because we in the UN work so much in silos that we weren't prepared for what was such a complex process, and one that actually was grounded in all human rights. And I'll give you an example that perhaps my colleagues in these organizations wouldn't be that appreciative that I do, but that, for example, the peace mission, which was formed very much at the end of the peace process, came in with quite a few resources. They contracted UNDP to rent spaces for the FARC for the process of disarmament. Some of the community members in two particular places, there were 26 camps, came to us saying, do you know that the UNDP is renting a property that we are currently litigating in the land restitution process? It wasn't appreciated when I went over to speak to our colleagues that they needed to change what they were doing. But they were just trying to get quickly the land. They didn't really think about what land and how that would impact on the communities that were living there and were affected by the conflict. Second, relative to the peace mission and DPA, now DPPA, I had huge arguments about one aspect of the implementation of the peace process because we were very critical in our reports saying that the peace process wasn't going well. Because actually we were very familiar with the accord because we had been part of the process. And part of that was that when the FARC were in these groupment sites, that they were supposed to do local purchase. And you're going, what does that have to do with human rights? It has to do everything with human rights because economic exclusion was huge. Cocoa growing was important. And if you didn't begin a process to have these communities included in the economy, at that point you were going to lose them to other armed groups. And we argued and argued, and in fact we lost, and to a large degree were shut down. But that in reality what ended up happening was it was used as a corruption vehicle, a lot of central purchasing. Food was then sent to the regions even though the accord specifically called for local purchase. That then facilitated that people in those areas were wondering what benefit do we have from the peace process, even though we're supposed to do substitution and move to an inclusive economy, where is it? And so we lost huge numbers of people by not actually taking that seriously. My final point is that I think let's say those that drafted the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, now almost 75 years ago, had a better understanding of the interconnection between peace, development, and human rights than we do today. I think that there was a clear understanding that economic rights, when they wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was it was supposed to be part of the rule of law that was applied in every economic system. It's not today. I think our UN colleagues oftentimes forget that one of the first General Assembly resolutions was that we in the UN have an obligation to promote and respect human rights. And I think to a large degree, one of the problems is that we also, within the UN and in general in society, we don't understand human rights as being civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights. We're still stuck in a really, and not a dated concept, in a modified concept of what human rights are. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And I would love to have follow-up questions with you because I think there are loads, I mean, there are very many aspects of that to unpick, but there are two things that I take from what you've just said, and that's really how human rights can both be sort of this normative framework that grounds a lot of the work that we do and should ground the work that we do, but also as a tool to build better and more sustainable processes that are there with justice in mind for all and not just for a few. And a reminder also, a humble reminder of the impacts that we have if we don't have these in mind in terms of how we work, not just on what we work on, but how we work in different country contexts wherever we are, which is both human rights, but is also conflict sensitivity. So those are really keen reminders. And indeed, I've read the UN Charter and the human rights declarations many times going into meetings where people told me that they were separate, to just remind myself that no, they're not, and our forebears knew that and wrote it down. But back to the screen and back to Brian, and bouncing off what Todd just has been talking about, sort of this transitional justice as a process, and where often peace and justice find themselves in opposition, or at least in tension. Where sort of the political and social dynamics come to tension also with the notion of accountability. So perhaps tell us a little bit more about what are your thoughts about how transitional justice can be a tool and how it can be a tool for lasting peace. Brian, over to you.
Great, thanks so much. And I know you want this to be a conversation, so with your indulgence, I just want to pick on something that you ended on with Todd. And this is about how it's not just that 70 years ago leaders understood it. Political leaders today also very much understand that the connection between economics and social services and social well-being, let me put it that way, is deeply connected to human rights and to the political ways that nations govern themselves. I think one of the wonderful things about the job I have is working with the Peacebuilding Fund is we're trying to incentivize the full UN system to work together. So those silos that Todd mentioned, which are definitely a problem that all big complex institutions have, it is a problem that confounds us too. It's not that UNDP is not interested in peace building, but that particular task was getting land. The value of the UN system, if we do it right, is that by working together, we can learn from the other bits of the system that are looking at other aspects of this and make better progress. In the Peacebuilding Fund, one example quickly comes to mind. This year, we're doing an interesting project in Guinea-Bissau with WHO. So the World Health Organization is, not a typical peacebuilding organization that you might think of, but in Guinea-Bissau, the health sector has been on strike for a year. People don't have access to healthcare at all, and what's happening in the way the government manages the health sector is deeply connected to people's grievances, people's inclusiveness, and their rights. So, fully endorse and second the advocacy about how we need to sort of not let the powers that be pigeonhole us on the human rights front, but rather really see human rights as across the board. Absolutely. Okay, your question was about transitional justice. It's obviously a leading question because we've all been working on transitional justice for a long time. It is the label for a suite of activities that are trying to get specifically at this, how you balance, how a society and how individuals, families, communities, societies balance absolutely the imperative for justice. And we all know that it is very difficult to heal and to forgive without a sense of justice, and at the same time, the imperative for peace and the value that being able to wake up and go about your business every day and get your kids educated in a peaceful and safe and secure environment, how valuable that is not only for the particular day, right? Every day is a day, and it's very valuable if you can take care of your kid one more day, but how valuable that also is for creating an enabling environment for broader peace processes. So transitional justice is a big area of work. We fund a lot of activities in that area. You asked in your first question, you asked about the thematic review for local peace building. We also did a thematic review a couple of years ago in 2020 on transitional justice. So I encourage everybody interested to look that one up. To give an example, one of the things we work on a lot are truth and reconciliation commissions. I won't talk about Colombia because Todd's in the room, so he's the expert. and somebody online in Colombia, so I won't talk about Colombia, although we worked there too. In the Gambia, we've been pretty engaged. The UN action on the ground has been pretty engaged in supporting the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The key lessons about how to make those go well, they need to be independent, they need to be inclusive. That word's come up a lot this morning. You want to invest, where does our money go in these kinds of things? I mean, a lot of them go into very local and widespread consultation. So you want to go to towns and villages across countries and really encourage participation so that people can learn about what these processes are. It's not just something they see on TV, but they have an opportunity to engage with them in terms that are accessible and comfortable for them, right? You can't expect everybody to show up at a TV studio in the capital city necessarily. It's important that government is both respecting the independence of these commissions, but then also is put on the spot as the authorities to be accountable. And often you find yourself working with governments that are not the governments that were necessarily involved before, but they remain the government. They remain the authority, and it is on them to be accountable for the governance of countries. So it's really important how they see the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. In the case of the Gambia, for example, the report of the commission was ready for several months before government accepted formally and published the report of the commission. There's another bit of the peacebuilding of the United Nations peacebuilding architecture. So we're the Peacebuilding Fund. There's also a Peacebuilding Commission in New York. I hope everybody in the audience is familiar with that. If not, ask me some questions about it. The Peacebuilding Commission is an intergovernmental body. It's kind of a junior cousin to the Security Council. The Peacebuilding Commission, engaged with the government. The government of the Gambia came to the Peacebuilding Commission in New York, talked about its transitional justice process. This is also important because the peer community of the international community can both, provide advice, but also encourage, right? And provide some moral support for governments that are having to take some tough positions sometimes, some difficult positions that are not easy for politicians to take. So it was really important that the government published the report. They did. They made some commentary about, which of the recommendations they accepted and they didn't. And now it's important that we support communities and organizations to implement recommendations that are made. Some of those are recommendations for government and other for other actors. Very interested in supporting what are sort of called by the generic label the national human rights institutions. Sometimes these are ombudsman's offices. Sometimes these are independent human rights commissions. Another really important institutional forum that can carry forward the work of an ad hoc one-time transitional justice action, but can then anchor it in activities that can go forward. We know that transitional justice is a long-term, generational, sometimes multi-generational effort, and so it's important that there are institutions, the institutions of government that are of governing that are important for ensuring inclusion always. So whether that's a town municipal council or a national parliament, that these institutions are also aware and thinking about what their own roles are in terms of going forward, both to recognize what's happened in the past, and that might be different ways to convey apologies or understanding of what happened so that there's accountability there, even if it's not formal justice always. So these institutions like parliaments, municipal councils, local governments can carry forward on these things. So, I mean, transitional justice, tremendously important, generational effort on all parts, and again, work for both the authorities, the formal authorities, as well as for civil society and community actors. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I like your description of the Peacebuilding Commission, the junior cousin to the Security Council. I will use that again.
They might not like it if I put it that way.
I won't quote you, but I will certainly use it when I go to New York next. You've spoken about various actors in this transitional justice process. You've talked about the government, national human rights institutions. And I know, Anastasia, you will talk to us about the victim versus perpetrator and this, and you'll tell us more, but a perception of a dichotomy and how unuseful that might be in a transitional justice moment, which is inherently a delicate moment for a country. You know, we mentioned how strong institutions need to be able to carry that throughout generations, and yet these institutions have been undermined over a conflictual period. And where do we lie when it comes to this dichotomy, or at least perceived dichotomy between victims and perpetrators? Tell us more, Anastasia.
So let's go back to Marina's story. Is she a victim? Is she a perpetrator? Is she both, or something else? I think that a key point of that story is that ordinary people experience intense uncertainty when navigating armed conflict environments. Their personal trajectories in and out of armed groups are highly complex and cannot be reduced to the victim-perpetrator dichotomy. Time and again in my research, I learn about multiple push and pull factors that drive people into armed groups. For most people, the decision is not an individual one, but one embedded in quotidian networks of family and friends who experience the conflict together. For example, in many units of the FARC-EP in Colombia, combatants came from generations of armed group members, from grandfathers to fathers to sons. So for many individuals in this and other contexts, joining an armed group is not a choice at all, but the result of social pressures, lacking economic opportunities, forced recruitment, especially where armed groups act as the state. And once mobilized, combatants undergo formal, informal socialization processes within armed groups, including indoctrination, which shape their various behaviors in armed conflict, violent ones as well. And leaving these groups voluntarily is extremely difficult, if not impossible, as the repercussions of such choices can be severe. A vivid example of this is the killing of FARC ex-combatants, including by their former comrades who are now in FARC dissident groups. So my point is that recognizing these challenging trajectories can help destigmatize, humanize the experiences, and advance the potential of ex-combatants to contribute to peace, which I find, among other processes, in the critical role that former mid-level commanders of the FARC-EP have played in communicating the decisions made in Havana to rank-and-file combatants, disarming their units, and now contributing to transitional justice and leading ex-combatants' productive projects. So maintaining these individuals' commitment to peace is really essential for the peace process in Colombia and elsewhere, and perhaps the victim-perpetrator divide won't help us with that.
Thank you. And Anastasia is keeping to time so well that I'm sort of surprised by the end of her statement. But thank you very much. And I think that's really interesting to see stories a little bit differently and see people as rights holders as opposed to singularly as people who take away rights of others. And I think that's really important to remember the human behind the labels that we tend to very quickly put onto people. So back to Todd. Anastasia has spoken a little bit about sort of, and previously about looking at the history, looking back, looking at historicizing human rights. I'm going to invite you to look forward and that next step, or what is perceived sequentially as the next step when we talk about conflict, transitional justice, and then where does development come in? And I know your current position is about finding that out for OHCHR and looking at how that works with the triangle between human rights, development, and peace. So tell us a little bit more of how you see those interwebbed notions, silos, perhaps at the UN level, perhaps not so much at the operational level where it's sort of a messy in between. Tell us more.
Well, I had planned to put up some type of image, but I think I can get you to capture it. Think about peace over here on the right side of the screen, on one side of a river, and then development on the other side of the river, and then think that the bridge right now has two pillars and it ends. Now, when we start speaking about the bridge between peace and development, it has a name. And that name is ESCR. And it should have 4 pillars, and it would make it all the way from development, from peace to development. So I'm speaking about economic, social, and cultural rights. And that we really need to begin to look at what we're doing in peace operations and peace missions and peace interventions to take into consideration the full spectrum of human rights. And I'll give a few examples. When I was working in the Democratic Republic of Congo, I remember speaking to one of the people that came in that was cleaning. And I asked her, I said, well, how much are you earning? And I asked her, how much vacation do you have? And I said, who do you work for? And it was amazing to me to begin to see that what we have within these operations, because they're enormous. At that time, it was 28,000 people and billions of dollars a year, that we weren't actually creating the type of interventions that would allow us to begin that bridge construction. What we had was, I think I found out that it was 6 subcontractors from the original, then down, then down, then down, and then eventually it was the 6 that employed this particular woman. And that the amount of money we paid to the original subcontractor was sufficient to actually have those people have vacation and have a livable wage. And we need to actually begin to focus on this. That's partly the responsibility of the Secretariat. But there's another part that's the responsibility of the Security Council. Because even if the Security Council begins to speak a good game, they actually are extremely siloed. They will not fund anything that smells of development. And it's a problem. Because you cannot imagine having a successful peace process without dealing with the root causes of the problem. And many of our conflicts today are related to multiple forms of exclusion, ethnic, economic, and that we in the UN and the Security Council, which is mandating a lot of this activity, need to take our rhetoric and we need to rethink what we're doing. Because the amount of money that we're spending needs to be spent in a way that actually creates synergies about where we want to go in that particular country. And it's not that difficult. But it's just like economic policy in general. Economic rights aren't considered. And so we need to create a consciousness within these interventions that starts with the desire to create that bridge and name that bridge what it needs to be named. And include responsibility for both the Secretariat and the Security Council to take our own charter seriously, to take our own laws seriously. And we need to make investments in excluded communities. And we need to do that with the big money. Because the reality is that the amount of money in peace is often exponentially larger than the money in development. And that needs to change if we're actually serious about creating sustainable peace. And I think that, looking at the audience, I think it's really a task for you as we're moving forward, because it's something that's not really spoken about a lot. I think it's really not investigated enough from the academic side, and it's certainly there's almost no advocacy to change these things within the system. And we need to recognize that there is that name in the bridge and that we need to start changing our own practices so that then we can actually model relative to our advocacy for what are usually, but not always, dysfunctional states. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Walking the talk is what I take from that, and I think it's really important. As much as the grand labels of the UN have, is also being able to do that with integrity in terms of how we make projects and how we are in different country contexts. And naming it, and I think that's that's part of some of the work that I do at the Quaker United Nations office, is trying to bring human rights to peace and not being scared of talking about it. 5 years ago in New York, it was very, very difficult, and I think it's slowly shifting, and this panel shows that as well, and I think it's sort of a testimony of how things have slowly changed over the last years. Anjli, you've been waiting patiently, so thank you for bearing with us here on the stage. You have the sort of last word in terms of my questions, and then we'll go to the audience here. But you know, a lot of what we've been talking about is sort of interdisciplinarity and how to enable that, really, because the lived experience is a messy, all of it. It's not just human rights, it's not just development, it's not just peace and security, it's all of it. And it feels like a lot of the difficulties are actually taking a few steps back, looking at the institutions that we've managed to create and the way that things have been organized. So tell us a bit how to dismantle that and remantle that to enable interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have any answers. I think Todd is starting to get at some of it, but maybe, you know, I'm not going to focus on what we should fund and what we should be doing. Of course, we should be funding across silos. Of course, people don't, as you say, people's lived experience is messy, and they don't just have a problem with respect to accountability and impunity for justice. They also have a problem with wanting to have access to a good education and wanting to have access to a good hospital. And so I think part of this is of course what we fund, but it's also how we fund. I will make the controversial statement here that nothing will ever get done through a log frame. And so funders need to stop acting in log frames and like, here's a tick box response that I can have to whether a civil society organization did what they did, or let me, you know, teach you how to sort of embed and deepen the bureaucracy. My argument is that we shouldn't really be trying to train and create bigger national civil society or bigger UN-like organizations or trying to replicate that at the local level. We should be making those organizations much more like nimble local organizations that actually are responsive to lived communities. So that's the first thing. I think that the ways in which funding happens, you know, you fund human rights things, you fund peacebuilding things, you insist that you have to have, you know, one person to write up the report, and all they do is write reports, and that's just not going to get anything done. The second thing is who is in the room. I think there's a lot of questions around, you know, most of the panels have talked about, you know, this person in this country or the lived experience of this person impacted by conflict, and most of the time those people are not actually consulted, or they're consulted in a way because now it's no longer palatable to have, you know, a panel full of Westerners, and so, you know, we need to have somebody there. And it's very tokenized. People generally know what they want. You know, people are experts in their own lived experience and in their own needs. And so, and those needs tend to shift over time. So going in and asking somebody once, you know, what do you want, is not a good answer. Most of, you know, a lot of my work focuses on the search for the missing and exhumations and investigations. And often when I talk to family members, I'll talk to a mother of a victim and she'll just say, I just want to know where my son is. Like, find his body, return my son to me. And we do this, and we provide, you know, cause of death and manner of death. And then this mother says, I want justice, rightfully so. And so it's temporal, and it changes over time. And we need to sort of stop thinking about it as a sort of one-time initiative where we consult with experts. But in fact, those who are impacted need to be leading these organizations. They need to be at the forefront of the UN, and they need to not be like the fourth person on a panel that you have so that it looks inclusive. But we really need to start thinking about how do we make those systems work for the people impacted by it, and how do we shift our work so that people who are affected by everyday violence and exclusion, and not just in the global south or countries that experience ongoing conflict, but those who sit in the global north but continue to be excluded, how are they actually making decisions in a lot of these spaces?
Thank you very much. I was asked when I put together this panel, what is the thread? And I didn't have an answer, because I think the topic is very complex and you can look at it from different sides, and it's a bit like I'm going to say like you know, a ball or a sort of, a multifacet. I don't know what it's like yeah. So you can look at it from different sides. There are different perspectives. There's so many people that are working at the intersection in different ways. So that's why I wanted to present to you these different voices that have worked in different country situations, both closer to what is, you know, Geneva Peace Week, so Geneva, but also further afield. So I hope I've been able to give you a flavor of how human rights, inequalities, and peace come together. But over to you now. I'm sure you have loads of questions. We have 10 minutes, but I hope that I can bleed into the break between the high-level panel, which is this one, and the next event. So hands raised, and I know there's somebody with a mic going to come to you. I see a gentleman here at the front. Don't be shy. And there's somebody over here. Ah, yes, the gentleman also on the left. We don't bite, and we're quite far away, so don't be scared.
Thank you. My name is Shoaib Timouri, and I'm from the Center for Dialogue and Progress, Geneva. I think good examples were given, especially on the role of the UN and what you are doing. I want to ask the panelists about the special case of Afghanistan, of what the UN did during the peace negotiations between the Taliban and the US government. Because when you read the withdrawal agreement between the US and the Taliban, there is no mention of human rights, even once. So does the UN have a special procedure to ensure that when peace is negotiated, when peace is discussed, human rights is also talked, and it is there in the accords? Also, the special representative of the UN told the Security Council a few months ago that peace has come to Afghanistan. But in light of the atrocities that are taking place in Afghanistan every day, what is the relationship between those rights that are written there and the peace that the UN claimed has come to Afghanistan? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take a couple and then come back to the panel in the name of time. We have one question specifically to our two panelists from the UN. We have the gentleman over there. Sorry, we're doing your 10,000 steps now. No, it's fine. I know. And for others, do think about another question.
Thank you. I have been very interested by the discourse on transitional justice. I think it's very available. But after the war and during the war, how can we protect human rights? I'm thinking of Ukraine, with the occupation of the Russian army, and human rights are mostly disrupted there now during that war. And how would it be possible to imagine another way of solving conflict during occupation? And I think of Gandhi and of nonviolent civilian resistance. Would it be possible in time of such occupation just to respect human rights by using nonviolent civilian defense? There has been a lot of examples in Czechoslovakia and in Lithuania, just precisely during Soviet occupation. Would you think it would be possible also now in Ukraine to respect human rights by using civilian defense instead of retaliating with weapons as they do now? Thank you.
I will hand that question to the panel. I will. Any other questions in the room before I go back? Because I don't know if there'll be time for another round. Last chances. No?
There's a fellow here.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I can't see your hand. Oh, two more questions. Excellent. So if you give the mic to him, and I'll give my mic to Andrea.
It's for the online video, yes.
Yeah, thanks very much. There was a lot of talk about local peace building, and I very much appreciate also the last remarks by Anjli Parrin about that. I was just wondering what happens if the local happens to look different to how we want the local to look like. So I think Brian Williams was saying to support local civil society, etc., right? In many situations, local institutions might, for instance, be linked to liberation movements, right? And might not confine to a liberal democratic standard of local civil society. Thank you.
It's more a comment to you concerning your remark, the pillar, the bridge, being between development and human rights, being and peace, being the civil, the desk, the civil, the economic, social, cultural rights. I cannot agree more. I think when I heard it concerned the UN, but I think your comment was also broader. When I hear often in the peace-building community, there is a reluctance to speak about human rights because it is seen as something as naming and shaming, as and this dimension of economic and cultural rights is not so much taken into account. So I think there is also a need to do more to inform, maybe to train with examples in the broader peace-building community about this bridge. Being the states, being the NGOs and international NGO, beginning here in Geneva, by the way. It's a conversation that I very seldom listen into in the peace-building arena. So thank you.
Go ahead with any question.
Brian? No, I've known him since Rwanda, 1994-95, so I can do that.
We're in the same place. So we have a question on transitional justice, which I think is very much linked to the UN. We have a question on the Ukraine and how to be able to protect human rights there currently during the conflict, but that as an enabler of peace as well. And we have a question here about what about local, when local doesn't look like the box that we want it to be in. Over to whoever wants to answer those questions one after the other. We can start with the screen. Brian, if you want to start, then we'll have Anastasia, then Todd, and then Anjli as the last word.
Okay, thanks for the participants. Those are tough questions. So you've gotten at some of the core issues. So congratulations. You've used your lack of lunch hour well. Look, on Afghanistan, I don't know which special representative said there was peace in Afghanistan. I think the Secretary General has been very clear that there are continuing fundamental human rights challenges, particularly around women and girls, but not only. I think Afghanistan has challenged the international community to think about how it engages. I think there is some acknowledgement on the part of the international community that they have responsibility for what's happening to Afghans and communities, and they're struggling with how to respond. The humanitarian support is, we shouldn't, I think, dismiss the value of humanitarian assistance. It is tremendously valuable. It saves lives, and it's able to work in a lot of environments where I don't know if that's another river and a different bridge, Todd, but it's able to work in places. It's able to work in places that other organizations struggle with. What I can say is that in general, whenever possible, absolutely the United Nations encourages that human rights be addressed in peace discussions. The United Nations is not involved in every peace discussion. The United Nations is not asked to be involved in every peace discussion. But when the UN is involved, absolutely we work hard, including the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to bring human rights to the table. In Papua New Guinea, for example, I know from the Peacebuilding Fund's perspective, we've been supporting UN organizations to support the dialogue there between Bougainville and the national government. We do community consultations that encourage communities to bring all of their issues to the table and try and feed that into the formal peace discussions where possible. It's not always easy, but absolutely we're committed to it. And you know, if we're not doing it in a setting where it should be done, then we count on partners to help bring us to account. On the local, I don't know if I go to all questions, I'll use up all the time. It's not fair. Let me address the two other points. One is the local peace building question, and you know, sometimes organizations, you know, might not look like what a liberal, global liberal view might look like. You know, absolutely. The world's the world's peace and conflicts in particular are messy. I think what we're trying to hear from those who are advocating to go local. Oh, I should say something about log frames and also. What we're trying to say is that we shouldn't shy away from engaging locally. And, you know, we have due diligence procedures. We have human rights organizations that help us look at organizations and what they're doing and not doing. So it doesn't mean that, you know, you don't pay attention to what organization you're engaging with. That's true if we're dealing with the private sector too. We have due diligence, you know, so it's the same for any partner that you might be working with. It's not a reason not to engage though. And, you know, there are times when it might be, you know, it becomes very case by case, because there's times when it's appropriate to work with organizations that might have some affiliation, and there are times when it might not be. I think we can't be so narrow-minded as to only work with organizations that, you know, line up directly with what we think an appropriate response to a given setting might be. Sort of by definition, going local means, you know, you're not coming with a preconceived notion. Maybe just on the log frames thing. Look, we all want to be nimble, but we also want to work with resources at scale and with resources that matter. And, you know, let me go to, you know, Todd did great advocacy for the Peacebuilding Fund about the importance of investing real resources in development in ways that are peace positive. And, you know, one of the lessons that I take from the global COVID tragedy, and it's a tragedy in many ways, but one of the lessons is there isn't a shortage of money. Money became available to treat COVID in trillions of dollars immediately. So the issue is not the world has never been as wealthy as it is today. The issue is we're not putting those resources in the right places. And a lot of what, you know, in peace building, in excluded communities and excluded geographies and excluded ethnic or groups, in excluded socio and economic rights and cultural rights, we're not putting enough resources. So how do we start talking about resources at scale? And it's very tricky to do that if you're really doing a complete sort of hands-off, no log frame, because, you know, the way big institutions and money works in the world, you have to have some kinds of mechanisms for accountability that allow you to aggregate upwards and deal with the level of resources that at least I think are what are justified and merited in many of these communities and which can make a difference. Sorry, I took you.
Thank you, Brian. Obviously, the log frames discussions is inflammatory. Anastasia, over to you for your sort of concluding remarks, wrapping in some of the questions, if you could.
Thank you so much. I'd like to speak about the protection of human rights during armed conflict. And we have seen this to one extent or the other, particularly in internal armed conflicts beyond international human rights and humanitarian law, through various mechanisms, from ideologies of armed groups that proscribe certain forms of violations, such as sexual and gender-based violence, to institution building by armed groups when they try to become legitimate actors within the spaces that they occupy and control, to emergence of peace communities in response to armed actors. We see that prominently in Colombia, for example. But these mechanisms have been possible in contexts where armed groups rely on civilian populations for support in one way or another. And this is not the case in Ukraine proper. And so we cannot quite rely on those mechanisms when thinking about what's going on in Ukraine right now. And the second brief point here is that we need to also differentiate the distinct conditions that we are currently facing in Ukraine proper versus the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and Crimea, because the situation with human rights there is dramatically different, and potentially some of these mechanisms might apply in some contexts, but not in others. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Anastasia. Todd, your last words. That sounded ominous.
I hope not.
Sorry.
But that, very briefly, I'll touch on all questions in abuse of time. But I think in Afghanistan, we should go a little bit further back and start to look at the 20-year intervention, or I forget exactly how long, and remember that the bridge between peace and development didn't exist. It was a very security-oriented process. And the amount of money that was invested in economic rights that would have created a more sustainable peace by actually facilitating the participation and change wasn't made. And I think we need to look back. And I mean, the amount of money that was spent relative to the amount of investment in the people was very little. I am worried about what you said. I'll talk to you afterward. I think we all in the UN have an obligation relative to human rights. And sometimes there is statements made that we need to make sure that we go to that person and say, we're wondering what you said. But as Brian said, that shouldn't be the policy. I think also in the context of Ukraine, we were doing a project on pensions in occupied Ukraine before the invasion. And why do I say that? Because oftentimes in the context of conflict, we forget about economic rights. We forget about economic, social, and cultural rights. And that in many ways, if there is an impingement in terms of social protection from the current government to the people that are living in the occupied zones, and that government and the government isn't able to provide that assistance, there's a problem. And that it provides additional arguments in terms of what is happening in the zone for discussion. And so I think that it is important that the question is flushed out more and that we see different creative ways of dealing with it. In Colombia, we knew that the groups in the communities were influenced. They'd lived under the FARC. That's why we picked to work there. They knew them. And so, they were actually very much targeted in the post-peace process because of the fact that there wasn't the integration and their new armed groups came in. And so you saw many community leaders that had been killed. The bridge. We need one more pillar, though. In Spanish, right, desca is actually much more important in terms of including the rights of environment, rights related to environment, because in the usage in Latin America, they always put them together. And it's actually very useful. And I think that we need 5 pillars, not 4.
Thank you. If you're interested in what local looks like and and it's a particular spin when looking at non-state armed groups, come to the high-level conversation with Funula, the Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism. She'll be unpacking some of the problematics around the funding and the supporting of peace processes or peace projects when it's really hard to untangle who's an armed actor and who's not. And that's been really detrimental to many situations when it comes to those who tried to help and who cannot anymore. Anjli, the last word is yours.
I'll be very quick. I think, these kinds of discussions are super important to ensuring that those who are in positions of deciding what money goes where, what we should be doing, how we should be thinking about economic, social, cultural rights, the environment, is really crucial. And ensuring that we have, of course, local is going to look different in every space. And local actors know this as well. And so they will most definitely camouflage to meet a sort of liberal understanding of what local is. Ultimately, actors on the ground are highly nimble and flexible and understand the discourse of the UN really well. And so the imperative really, I think, is on large institutions to start to change and to find something that matches with that. To start to think about, okay, how do we mobilize large amounts of resources in a way that will actually be impactful? How do we think about the the non-human in human rights, and what, you know, how is that frame itself problematic, and how has that led to probably the, you know, the climate crisis that we're in right now, and how do we start to move and think about things at a much longer scale, so that we're not thinking about it at the sort of 1 year, 5 year, 10 year, but 50 years, 100 years, and then we start to have a different conversation about prevention, rights, justice, and inequality.
Thank you. Thank you to Brian, Anastasia on screen, Anjli and Todd here on the panel with us. And I realized I completely forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I was a Florence Foster from the Quaker United Nations office. And the word I was trying to find earlier is disco ball. So think of this conversation as a disco ball, and I hope it's inspired you to think a little bit more of how human rights intersect in your world as peace builders. Thank you very much. They can't see. Thank you. Bye. Bye, Anastasia. Bye, Brian. Thank you.
Bye, thanks so much.
Bye, thank you very much.